When it came time to choose a college, Dru and her father, Alan, talked it over carefully. The University of North Dakota in Grand Forks kept coming up. It was a strong school, a welcoming campus, and Grand Forks itself had the feel of a safe, tight-knit college town. Alan would later say that he encouraged her to go specifically because it felt like the right kind of place. The kind of place where a young woman could focus on her future without having to worry. More than 300 miles separated Dru from her parents once she enrolled, but she kept the distance from feeling large. She called home regularly, came back for school breaks, and made sure her family stayed close in every way that mattered, even when they weren't physically near. By the fall of 2003, Dru was a senior. She had built a full life in Grand Forks. She had close friends, a boyfriend named Chris Lang, a campus community she was deeply invested in. She volunteered, held an internship, and worked 2 part-time jobs simultaneously, one of which was at the Victoria's Secret store inside the Columbia Mall. She was, by any measure, thriving. There was nothing fragile or reckless about how she moved through the world. She was careful, capable, and deeply loved. Saturday, November 22, 2003, started like any normal day. Dru was scheduled for an afternoon shift at Victoria's Secret. She worked until 4 o'clock, then decided to stay in the mall for a little while to get some shopping done before heading to her second job later that evening. She wandered into Marshall Field's, one of the anchor department stores at the Columbia Mall, and started browsing. She was looking for something to give her mother for Christmas, a detail that later made the day feel even more unbearable to those who loved her. She found something she liked and made her purchase. Shortly after 5 in the evening, she was on her phone with Chris, chatting as she made her way through the store toward the exit. At 5:04 in the afternoon, the call dropped. It was abrupt. No goodbye, no warning, just silence on Chris's end of the line. He assumed it was bad reception. College towns, shopping malls, spotty service. It happens. He expected a call back in a few minutes. He waited. No call came. He tried her number. No answer. An hour passed. Then another. At 7:42 that evening, his phone finally rang, and Dru's name lit up on the screen. He answered immediately, relieved. But there was no voice on the other end. No greeting, no explanation. Just static, ambient wind noise and the faint sound of buttons being pressed, as though the phone had been activated accidentally. The call ended as suddenly as it had begun. Chris called Dru's mother. He was careful with his words. He didn't want to alarm her unnecessarily, but he told Linda he hadn't been able to reach Dru and that she hadn't shown up for her second job. Linda would later say that she knew immediately, in the way that parents sometimes simply know, that something was wrong. She called Alan. They began reaching out to Dru's friends and co-workers. Nobody had seen her. Nobody had heard from her. By 9 o'clock that night, they had called the police. Alan got in his truck and drove through a snowstorm. The roads were dangerous, the kind of winter conditions that close highways in Minnesota, but he drove anyway, following a semi-trailer through the worst of it just to keep moving forward. He arrived in Grand Forks after 2 in the morning, went straight to the Columbia Mall parking lot, and found Dru's car exactly where she had left it. Everything was inside. Her wallet, her cash, her driver's license, the shopping bag from Marshall Field's, with a Christmas gift for her mother still tucked inside. The only thing missing was her cell phone. That detail, Alan later said, set off every alarm in him. Everything she needed to live her daily life had been left behind. Only the phone was gone, and the phone, as they already knew, had been active long after she had disappeared from the mall. Alan stayed in that parking lot through the rest of the night. He sat in the cold, watching for his daughter. It was the only thing he could think to do. Morning came without her. Dru's parents went public immediately, appearing on local television, asking the community for help. Their urgency was unmistakable, and it worked. The police began treating the case with the seriousness it deserved, and hundreds of volunteers mobilized within days. Investigators turned to Dru's cell phone records, tracing the signal as the phone continued to ping towers even after her disappearance. The data pointed toward Crookston, Minnesota, a town roughly an hour west of Grand Forks, across the state line. That single detail shifted the nature of the investigation significantly. A kidnapping that had crossed state lines meant federal involvement, broader resources, and a case that was now being watched by the entire country. The cell phone went silent. The search expanded and then stalled. Weeks passed. Dru's case had national media coverage, but coverage alone doesn't find missing people. And as December gave way to January, the fear that the case might go cold became harder to push aside. Then something unexpected happened. 1,500 miles away, in a small town in Oregon, a woman named Shirley Iverson was watching the evening news when a segment about Dru's disappearance came on. As the reporter described the details, the mall, the parking lot, the nature of the abduction, Shirley felt something drop inside her chest. She recognized the pattern. She had lived through it herself. In 1974, when Shirley was an 18-year-old college freshman, a man named Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. had asked her for a ride home. She knew of him vaguely. His brother was a classmate of hers. The distance was short, only a few blocks, so she agreed. He sexually assaulted her during that ride, strangling her in a way that she later described as producing a terror unlike anything she had ever known. She survived. She reported what had happened and climbed that flight of stairs to wake her mother and tell her what she had endured, a moment she described, nearly 3 decades later, as one of the hardest things she had ever done. The story of Dru Sjodin is not only a story about what was lost. It is also a story about what people do when they refuse to let loss be the only ending, and about how one young woman's life, even after it was taken, continued to protect people she had never met. Investigators drove to a construction site in McIntosh, Minnesota, where Alfonso was working, and confronted him directly. Within minutes, he admitted that he had been in Grand Forks on November 22nd, and that he had been at the Columbia Mall. He denied any involvement in Dru's disappearance. The detectives held him overnight, but without sufficient evidence for charges at that moment, they were forced to release him the following morning. The investigation, however, was far from over. Surveillance continued around the clock. A warrant was obtained to search his car. What investigators found inside told a story that was difficult to look away from. The vehicle appeared to have been meticulously cleaned. The interior was almost immaculate in a way that felt deliberate rather than habitual. In the trunk were a fishing rod and a pair of rubber gloves. There was the strong smell of cleaning solution. And there was a glass jar filled with bleach, submerged in which was a lock blade knife. Forensic technicians conducted a more thorough examination of the vehicle and found tiny specks on the upholstery and on the rear passenger window. Those specks were blood. Laboratory testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Dru Sjodin. When Dru's family learned the blood had been found in Alfonso's car, it was, as one of them described it, like being unable to breathe. The evidence was devastating, and yet they continued to hold on to hope, because hope was the only thing that hadn't been taken from them yet. Alfonso was arrested. Investigators pressed him for any information that might indicate where Dru could be found, whether she could still be alive somewhere. He refused to say anything. He shut down completely. The search continued, now with a focused urgency, because somewhere out there, either Dru needed to be found, or she needed to be brought home. 147 days after she had walked out of Marshall Fields, a law enforcement officer searching along a rural roadside in Minnesota looked down into a ravine and saw something that he immediately knew he had not wanted to find. It was Dru's body. She had been brought to that remote location, and her life had been taken from her. The coroner's examination established the cause of her death and confirmed what the forensic evidence had already begun to suggest about the nature of the crime. Dru's parents received the news that every parent searches their heart to find the strength to survive. The community that had mobilized so powerfully in the weeks after her disappearance came together again, this time to mourn. Memorial services brought hundreds of people who had known Dru personally and hundreds more who had followed her story and felt, in some real way, that they had come to know her through the search. She was remembered as someone who had made the world better in specific and tangible ways, through her warmth, her energy, her investment in the people around her. Her father described the experience of losing her as one that could not fully be absorbed even by a parent who had spent decades trying to protect his child from exactly this kind of harm. The trial of Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. began on August 14, 2006, in federal court. The prosecution walked the jury through the surveillance footage, through the forensic evidence, through the timeline of November 22nd. Jurors watched Rodriguez move through the mall on that day, browsing aisles with no apparent interest in their contents, positioning himself near exits, studying the women moving through the store. They watched him follow a woman out of the building, realize she wasn't who he was waiting for, and return inside. They saw the moment less than 2 hours later, when Dru appeared on camera, making her way toward the exit after finishing her shopping. He had made his decision, the prosecution argued, with cold and deliberate intent. Shirley Iverson took the stand and told her story. She described what Alfonso had done to her in 1974, the assault, the strangulation, the terror of surviving something that should have been allowed to end her life. Dru could not speak for herself in that courtroom, but Shirley's testimony gave the jury a window into the pattern of this man's behavior that stretched back nearly 30 years. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On August 30, 2006, Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. was found guilty of the kidnapping and murder of Dru Sjodin. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. A kidnapping that had crossed state lines meant federal involvement, broader resources, and a case that was now being watched by the entire country. The search was extraordinary in its scale and in the devotion behind it. Over 1,300 volunteers spread across rural roads, walked ditch banks shoulder to shoulder in freezing temperatures, and covered the region with flyers. People came by the busload. Dru's parents were at the center of it all, refusing to stop, refusing to entertain the possibility of giving up. A week after her disappearance, searchers combing the riverbanks near Crookston found a single black shoe at the edge of the Red Lake River, beneath a highway overpass. Dru's family confirmed it matched what she had been wearing the day she went missing. The discovery brought no comfort, only the terrible image of a young woman somewhere out in that frozen landscape without her shoes. Shirley called the tip line. She told investigators about Alfonso Rodriguez, and she told them his name with certainty. Police pulled his photograph and went back through hours of surveillance footage from the Columbia Mall, reviewing every angle recorded on November 22, 2003. What they found was deeply disturbing. A man matching Alfonso Rodriguez's description had been inside the mall that day for an extended period of time. He had walked the aisles with no apparent interest in merchandise. He had stood near exits, watching. At one point, he had followed a blonde woman out of the store, a woman who bore a distant resemblance to Dru and who had no idea how close she had come to a far more dangerous outcome. She had left the mall unharmed. Less than 2 hours later, Dru walked out through a different exit. She walked into a mall on a Saturday afternoon to buy her mother a Christmas gift. She was on the phone with her boyfriend. She was 22 years old, a senior in college, with her whole life stretched out ahead of her. And then, between 1 minute and the next, she was simply gone. No scream, no struggle that anyone witnessed. No trace left behind except a parked car and a shopping bag sitting in the back seat, with the gift still inside. What happened to Dru Sjodin in those few seconds between stepping out of a department store and reaching her car would shake an entire region, expose a dangerous gap in the American justice system, and ultimately change federal law forever. This is her story, and it deserves to be told completely. Dru Sjodin grew up in Pequot Lakes, a small, quiet town tucked into the lakes country of central Minnesota. It is the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where neighbors know each other by name, and where a parent could reasonably feel that their child was growing up far from the dangers of the wider world. Dru thrived in that environment. By every account from the people who knew her, she was the kind of person who made a room feel warmer simply by walking into it. She was energetic, deeply caring, quick to laugh, and deeply committed to the people she loved. Her mother, Linda, would later describe her as someone who was genuinely coming into herself, a young woman who knew who she was and wasn't afraid to be exactly that person. For the investigators who had worked the case, for the volunteers who had walked frozen ditches in the dead of a Minnesota winter, and for everyone who had come to know Dru's story, the verdict brought a measure of justice that, while it could not restore what had been taken, could at least be called by its name. What followed the verdict is part of why Dru's story continues to matter today. When the full picture of Alfonso Rodriguez's history came into public view, that he had been convicted of violent sexual crimes decades earlier, had served 23 years in prison, and had been released as a registered sex offender before taking Dru's life, Dru Sjodin directed her grief into action. She began advocating loudly and persistently for a national, publicly accessible database of registered sex offenders. The logic was simple. If the public had been able to know that a violent level 3 sex offender was living and moving freely in their community, the circumstances that led to Dru's death might have been different. Knowledge is a form of protection. Linda's advocacy reached Washington. In 2006, the legislation known as Dru's Law was signed into federal law, establishing the National Sex Offender Public Registry that remains in use today. It was a direct and lasting legacy born from the worst possible circumstances. Linda continued her advocacy work beyond the passage of that law, partnering with organizations focused on self-defense training for young people and speaking across the country on behalf of all victims, not only Dru, but every person whose story had not received the same attention. Dru Sjodin was 22 years old. She was buying a Christmas gift for her mother. She was on the phone with the person she loved. She did nothing wrong. What happened to her was not inevitable. It was the result of failures in the systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of harm. Her mother transformed that failure into change. Her father sat in a cold parking lot all night because he could not bear to be anywhere else. Her friends carried her memory into their lives and carried it forward. And Shirley Iverson, the survivor who made a phone call from 1,500 miles away because she recognized a pattern she had lived through herself, gave investigators the name that broke the case open. Alan stayed in that parking lot through the rest of the night. He sat in the cold, watching for his daughter. It was the only thing he could think to do. Morning came without her. Dru's parents went public immediately, appearing on local television, asking the community for help. Their urgency was unmistakable, and it worked. The police began treating the case with the seriousness it deserved, and hundreds of volunteers mobilized within days. Investigators turned to Dru's cell phone records, tracing the signal as the phone continued to ping towers even after her disappearance. The data pointed toward Crookston, Minnesota, a town roughly an hour west of Grand Forks, across the state line. That single detail shifted the nature of the investigation significantly.